welcome all of you. Welcome all of you to this webinar. This is the second webinar that ISD is running in a couple of weeks, focused on the intersection between trade policy and climate change action. So the first of the two webinars that we ran in this series took place on Thursday last week, and that presented two new IISD reports. The first looked at the trade of raw materials for use for electric vehicle batteries and highlighted some key lessons key policy lessons from the extraction of cobalt in the Democratic Republic of Congo and lithium in Chile as part of that value chain. And the second report focused on one of the most difficult and most topical questions in industrial policy, as many policymakers are wrestling with it. And that was the question of when to use trade policy to try and produce components, in this case for renewable energy domestically, and when it made sense to try and import these components. And we looked also in that report at how trade policy settings reflected governments' different policy imperatives and how they were considering that particular decision. So each of the two reports from last Thursday and the two that we're going to look at today, I find actually quite interesting because it draws on IISD's combined sort of experience and skill sets, combining engineering in some cases, economic and trade policy perspectives in quite unique ways. So today's session gives you a snapshot of two further reports that ISD has been working on. The first looks at net zero and circular economy commitments made in large markets, and thinks through what the implications of the implementation of these commitments could be for developing country exports, particularly to those markets. So that's the first report. The second report, I think, is particularly novel because it looks not at climate change mitigation, but at climate change adaptation and the role that trade policy could play in supporting this crucial but often overlooked policy priority. Now, all of this work was done with the support of the Government of the United Kingdom, their Foreign, Commonwealth and Development Office, and we're very grateful for that support, and I wanted to record that here. So we'll now move to the reports themselves. We're going to move through them quite quickly, I have to warn you, both the presentations themselves and the comments from the discussants, essentially because our objective is to give you a snapshot of the key findings of these reports so that you can then follow up and read the reports themselves. The first report on net zero and circular economy is already online on ISD's website, and we'll put the link to it in the chat. And the second one on adaptation we expect to be published in the course of the next 10 days or a week or so. So the first report is going to be presented by IISD's Senior Associate Tom Moorenhout, who is one of the report's co-authors, and that's going to be followed by a short discussion from Enrique Pacini. Many of you will know him. He's an Economic Affairs Officer at UNCTAD. And Enrique's intervention is in a sense double virtual because it's in fact in the form of a video presentation. So he has some nice succinct comments for us to hear by video. The second report, the one on adaptation, is going to be presented by Anne Hamill and her colleagues in the resilience team at IISD. And then we will have a few comments from Ambassador Mere Falemaka from the Pacific Island Forum Secretariat Office here in Geneva. And that will focus, because in particular that report focuses on adaptation priorities in the Pacific. So we're delighted to have you with us, Ambassador. Thank you for taking the time. Those will be the speakers of today. I will do my best to keep everyone to time, so we have a little bit of time at the end for questions and answers before we will have to rush off to your 3 o'clock appointments. So with that, I will stop sharing my screen and give the floor to Tom. Tom, the floor is yours.
Super. Thank you very much, Alice. I'm going to share my screen for presentation. I'm going to fly right in. I'm going to try to stick to my 10-15 minutes. Can you see the opening slide now? Yes? Or do you see the presentation mode?
We see it in presentation mode. So okay. If you go up to swap displays, that should fix it.
Let's just get rid of the external screen. It's still there, but well, this works as well, I think, right? So on the impacts of climate change policies on developing country export markets, right? So a quick sort of setting of the scene, you know, we looked specifically at net zero targets and circular economy plans. Net zero targets are adopted in at least 6 countries, awaiting formal adoption in 6 more, and under discussion in even 100 more countries, right? So that is gaining speed across the developed economies, but also emerging economies and developing economies at the same time. We see a similar thing for circular economy policies, right? Besides the EU, China, Indonesia, India, Mexico, South Africa are all countries with circular economy frameworks in place. So just to say that at this point, those frameworks are kind of very widespread. And in total, it was found that about 68% of world GDP and 56% of its population can be covered by net zero plans that are either already adopted or very much in the process of adoption. So the impact on the economy of these plans is going to be very significant. And from that, we basically ask the question: what are going to be the impacts of such policies on the export of goods from low-income economies, right? So important as well to say about anything that we're going to talk about here. We're really looking at export of goods, not services. A quick methodological note, just because I think it's always good to tell people exactly what we've done, right? So what we did is we took an assessment of 22 major net zero commitments and 28 circular economy plans. We went through those in details and identified sort of the most common elements by sector, right? And then we used basically current patterns and growth forecasts to see what might happen to some of the key markets in sub-Saharan African countries, in low-income countries, and in least developed countries. So we took those three groups. Now, this method does also have a few caveats. It's important to recognize. Number one is that a lot of these policies, even when adopted, they still look quite aspirational, right? So there's not yet necessarily frameworks in place for implementation. So one question is already to what extent they will be implemented in the next 1 to 2 to 3 decades. And other ones are, of course, even if they are implemented, what is the potential of import substitution from some of the products of these countries? And of course, the impacts on those countries are also not easy to assess, because a lot of these impacts will not be linear. We have taken a very static approach. We have taken basically a snapshot of what is happening right now, and sort of try to think along those ways. But some of that change might, of course, not be linear, and developing countries can also diversify their economies, whether that is downstream in current sectors or towards other sectors, right? So that caveat being said, these are the impacts on exports that are possible, right? So what we took here is sort of a few key sub-Saharan African countries that have the highest value in terms of trade exports, right? Exports of goods again. And here we see that, for example, developed Europe is actually still the biggest market. It's about $96 billion per year, which is very sizable, right? And so most of this would be covered now by net zero and circular economy plans within Europe. Second biggest market is Eastern Asia, with especially China at around 60 billion per year. And as you know, China also has recently put a net zero goal. So that is definitely important as well. And here you see some of the more important products, right? And so this we also saw when we looked at the net zero commitments and the circular economy commitments, two major overarching trends, which will be unsurprising for everyone. Number one is, of course, a reduction in the use of fossil fuels, right? That can give a big impact. And as you see here, if this is sort of the trade value, this is in the year 2018, roughly 1/3 of that is basically the exports of petroleum products, right? And the second big sort of impact that we're seeing from all of those commitments and those plans is actually the ability, the opportunity for the market in metals and minerals that are needed for the energy transition, right? And so we are going to quickly zoom in on those two. Starting with reduction in fossil fuel consumption. I think it's always good to have a look where we are and where we could go, right? This STEPS here, this is where we are. So STEPS is a scenario of the International Energy Agency, which is basically business as usual, but presuming that countries' commitments to date are being implemented, right? So if a country has a coal phase-out date, the IEA is going to presume that it's going to be implemented by the date that the country envisions. So this is what is happening in that type of scenario. And I'd like you to focus quickly on the red bar here, because that's really the big money maker. That's basically oil, right? So what we're actually seeing in the next decade under the IEA's business as usual scenario is that oil might still grow a little bit, but then it's going to stagnate and slowly decrease, right? Big difference if we are actually serious about net zero. Then in the next decade, we will basically see almost an instant peak oil demand today and a rapid decline after, right? So this is very important for trade from developing countries. In particular also because we don't, even if we expect demand to either slow down or be reduced rapidly, on the supply side, there's no problem, right? There's an abundance of oil supply, especially from competitors that actually have quite some financial buffers, that have quite some fiscal buffers, including Saudi Arabia, Russia, the Emirates, but also the United States, actually, with shale. And all of these countries also have a lot of subsidy power. So knowing that oil is the big money maker, the question is what space will there be for basically oil companies from developing countries. Yesterday I was speaking with the head of Equinor in Nigeria, and they are wondering the same, or they are thinking along similar lines, just to say that that type of tightening market is definitely of a concern for developing country export revenues, right? On gas and coal, I can be very quick because they are not that important in terms of export revenue, right? Gas, we're seeing a very similar thing. So the major growth markets are actually very far away. China is the biggest one, which means you would need to go to liquefied natural gas, right? But this is very capital intensive. And again, the competition will be very high because a lot of people are investing currently in liquefaction plants and so forth, which are both time and capital expensive. So that will also be a very tight market. And for coal, kind of the same story, but perhaps a bit more in the medium term. So the production in Sub-Saharan Africa is already decreasing, and it was by 10% in the last decade. And if the energy transition really accelerates, honestly, you know, coal is, as you can see from this graph, is actually one of the biggest sources of carbon emissions, right? So it will only really leave space for the lowest cost coal producers. So some of the impacts on that, this is why, you know, oil is the big money maker, right? So we're seeing that fossil fuels, I should have put the total figures as well, but fossil fuel exports from Sub-Saharan Africa, right? So this column is Sub-Saharan Africa, this column is least developed countries, right? So let's focus on Sub-Saharan Africa. Fossil fuels account for about 146 billion per year, right? This is by far the biggest export market for Sub-Saharan African countries. By far within that group, oil is the most important one, right? And most of that is crude. So we you know, to give a number of countries, the biggest ones are of course Nigeria and Angola, two oil producers. But there's also important relative impacts, right? Low-income countries like the Republic of Congo, South Sudan, Chad, Sudan, and Yemen are actually all sort of reliant on a big share of their export revenue on oil. So it's not just the big ones like in Nigeria, like in Angola, that will be confronted with a tough reality. Those smaller countries, for sure, will be in need of basically diversification, right? Then the question can be, what type of diversification, right? In the Middle East and North Africa, and especially in the Gulf, they are choosing now a model of diversification, which they call downstream diversification, right? So they like to invest into petrochemicals, refining, and so forth. Yeah. But again, very time intensive, very capital intensive, and given the tightening market, this is actually, you know, it seems like both high cost and high risk, especially if you know that refinery output has been declining as well. While the biggest consumer in the world and the one where most of the growth will be in China, they are now basically almost at 100% of domestic refinery capacity. Yeah. So in the last decades, they increased that by 70%. So that all to say that the picture is very bleak when it comes to fossil fuel markets in developing countries, especially in Sub-Saharan Africa, in LDCs. Now, the growing market for metals and minerals tells us another story, and that actually tells quite a positive story, right? If we look at the IEA scenario, for example, the net zero scenario, you see two big sectors where those carbon reductions need to accelerate and need to happen in the next decade, and between 2030 and 2040 as well. And one is the power sector and the other one is the transport sector, right? right? And to decarbonize both of those sectors, you really need some metals and minerals that are actually quite present in abundance in a lot of lower income countries, right? And I quickly, just to highlight that fact, added in a few graphs that you know, sort of demonstrate this point, right? So this is offshore wind and onshore wind and solar PV. And you can see that the resource requirements per megawatt. So a megawatt, of course, is installed capacity of electricity. So the resource requirements in terms of metals and minerals for renewables are far, far higher than natural gas and coal, right? So if we are talking about how wind and solar is, you know, and these are, is very clear from IEA models, disregarding whether the transition is going to accelerate or not, more than half of what we're going to add in terms of electricity capacity to 2040 is going to be wind and solar, right? So this market is going to expand very rapidly regardless. And so there will be a particular amount of resource needs for that. Same thing in the transport sector, right? So here we basically see the same comparison of different metals that are needed. And you can see that an electric car, of course, has a much higher need for those than conventional cars. This is a model done by colleagues from the World Bank. And you can just see that the anticipated demand growth is quite huge, right? So here in those graphs, we saw that, you know, per unit, you have quite a resource need. This is when you link that to different scenarios, right? So you have the IEA scenarios, you also have the IRENA scenario. And the IRENA renewable energy map scenario is perhaps the most sort of progressive one of those scenarios, that actually looks at a pathway to succeeding with net zero as well. And you can see that some of the growth rates are very significant, right? So even if you only consider them as ranges, we see that a lot of demand for some of those metals will at least double. And that in and of itself is immense. And so the impact on some of those markets, remember fossil fuels was today worth about, you know, 150 billion US dollars. Currently, metals is worth about 110 billion dollars. So we do see that on the macro picture, on a, you know, sort of on a big picture scale, that some of those export revenues that will be lost might be able to be offset with export revenues from raw metals and minerals, right? Of which some of the most important ones are copper and aluminium. And copper and aluminium are just incredibly important generally, both in electric vehicles and in electrification, right? So transmission, for example, relies very much on some of these metals as well. And again, also very important for least developed countries, right? Very different from the fossil fuel story, where actually supply was abundant and there was a lot of competition. We see a lot of competition in the mineral and metal markets as well, but supply is actually under stress, right? And this is linked to a few things. One is export restrictions in key markets, for example, in Indonesia, but also Democratic Republic of the Congo, where countries are implementing export restrictions to create more downstream value, right? I mean, developmentally, this can be a very good idea, but for the global market, you know, that adds another restriction, of course. And then, of course, there are, you know, climate and water stresses, which will be very important. A lot of mines in South America and in Australia are expected to suffer from that and not be able to grow as much as they could. And so as a result, there's actually, you know, we're seeing a big demand, but a lot of investment will be needed to meet that demand. And even more investment will be needed in developing countries if developing countries are to meet that demand, right?
I hate to interrupt, but I'm going to have to ask you to wrap up soonish because we're almost at your time limit. Go ahead.
That is perfect. I've only got basically one slide left anyway. So here, just to really highlight this opportunity again, right? We also see a bit of a complicated story with Cobalt. I know a lot of people are focusing on that, right? That makes sense. That is a story that probably was highlighted in the webinar last week as well, where different technology producers are looking to move away from a certain resource because of certain challenges associated to that resource. But for other minerals and metals, yeah, basically the investment opportunities is quite golden. This we don't need to look at. Very quickly, in 1 minute, a few emergent trade issues, right? So the diversification of the economy has always been on the agenda, right? This is only going to increase with countries that rely on fossil fuel exports, where the real agenda is actually not just diversification of the economy, but also diversification of export revenue and revenue in general, right? So what are the opportunities? Definitely support for South-South trade in diversification efforts, right? And we have a little graph that follows. That's one. And then the other big opportunity, of course, is minerals and metals for countries that have it, right? But there are a few challenges associated with that. One is need to make sure that this does not create a new resource curse. Sorry for the typo there. Resource curse, that it ensures local benefits, right? That it can focus much more on value added in the economy rather than just exporting and living off the rents, basically, of some of those fossil fuels. And for that, enhanced technical assistance and capacity building can definitely play a big role through ODA, through Aid for Trade. And the last thing I close with is just this graph to show the huge sort of diversification of exports within the Sub-Saharan African region, right? And so this is, of course, a very important thing to look at. If you look at some of the other countries, a lot of that is fuels, right? So this is fuels. And sort of exports are much more concentrated, while South-South trade basically is really an opportunity to diversify some of that revenue and keep it much more sustainable at the same time. Thank you. I'll stop here.
Thank you, Tom. That was really, really interesting. And thank you for letting me hurry you towards the end. I apologize. I hate that when I'm a speaker, but sometimes it needs to be done. So thank you very much. I think that was an extremely good synthesis at the end of what some of the emerging trade policy issues are. We were lucky enough to have some input from Enrique Pacini at UNCTAD in the review of this report, and he was also kind enough to offer some, in a video form, a short commentary on the report itself. So here in double virtual mode is Enrique. Go ahead, please, Eleanor.
Hi, my name is Enrique Pacini. I'm happy to comment on the ISD paper, Impacts of Climate Change Policies on Developing Country Export Markets. So countries with net zero commitments cover at least 23 countries or blocks, representing 68% of the global GDP. Countries with border tax adjustment proposals cover around 40% of world trade. This, of course, is counting preliminary legislation, so initial legislation offered in the US and the EU proposal on CBAMs, counting the transatlantic bloc alone. So 40% of world trade and 68% of the global GDP. Quoting from the report, countries will have to act swiftly to seize opportunities to enter growing value chains and reduce the negative impacts of value chains that will be worth much less in a net zero world. This is a classic threat and opportunity, of course raising questions on whether the sunsetting of sectors will be eased out by public subsidies, or the sectors will transform themselves from within, from dirty to clean, via gradual equity ownership into cleaner sectors. The report also shows that circular economy plans are increasingly popular, with at least 27 countries or blocks having them. Circular economy plans are, however, less straightforward to measure at a global level since the metrics and definitions vary. We can see from the ISD report that some net zero and circular economy plans are only aspirational, but others have higher credibility. For example, with the CBAM legislative proposals advancing in the EU, a similar proposal in the US, and the EU Sustainable Product Initiative, which is likely to set new requirements for placement of products in the EU market. If we try to take a step back, we can imagine that net zero and circular economy plans have in common three main aspects. The first aspect is a partial detachment from supply coming from underground. What do I mean with that? More renewables, materials and energy, reuse, recovery activities taking some sort of space from fossil inputs markets added into the biosphere. So this has some consequences. So relying less on the underground has some consequences. First, a large portion of developing country markets exports will be affected. We can expect higher competition for land as agriculture detaches from fossil inputs. More bioplastics are made from agroforestry outputs. Frictions in fossil to renewables energy transition, including implications for government tax revenue. Some challenges as primary producers versus secondary material suppliers fight for markets as the growth in reverse logistics allow the reused to better compete with the new. As also reflected in the ISD paper, metals are the second largest exports from developing countries. Their market will be disrupted if circular economy policies reducing demand, but as noted in a recent OECD report, metals already tend to find their way back into the economy. So competitiveness in that sector is likely to be determined by the agility in which countries can develop better reverse logistics systems, which is an argument that the ISD paper also makes for waste in general. The second point of commonality between net zero and circular economy policies are a realization that the carbon metric alone is not enough. The very coexistence of circular economy and net zero policies, also Green New Deals, so all these different nomenclatures, signal that a single focus on carbon is not enough. So imagine the planetary boundaries idea. Especially post-COVID, which served as a $3.9 trillion wake-up call on biodiversity preservation. Other areas such as electric mobility, which already has problems with used lead-acid batteries management in places like Bangladesh, manufacturing pollution, which impacts health and lowers the life expectancy of people around pollution sites, reducing countries' economic performance. Those are related topics, cross-border problems of similar importance. Thirdly, national approaches alone aren't sufficient. A systems approach involving value chains, international policy cooperation is essential. A closer working connection between Paris, Geneva, Washington, and Beijing is very important. While full agreement among all countries is hard to achieve, if a certain share of world trade falls under effective net zero or circular economy rules, it is likely to trigger systemic change by gravity effects. There are problems in the horizon though. The proposed legislation on carbon border adjustments in the US, for example, exempts trade partners who do not apply carbon taxes on US products, opening a potential large loophole. Much remains dependent on what will happen with legislation proposals in the EU and the US. Estimates of impacts of carbon policies in developing countries' exports can also be seen on a recently published report, the UNCTAD Trade and Environment Review, as well as on a recent paper of UNCTAD on the EU Carbon Border Adjustment Mechanism. Thank you for this opportunity.
Oh, and thank you very much indeed, Eleonora, for playing that for us, and virtual thanks to Enrique for putting that together. And just to underline one thing that I thought was particularly interesting there is the sort of conceptual shift from extracting more from underground to better using what we have overground and what the impacts of that might be. And I'd encourage you to also have a look at the report that we presented at the webinar last week, which looks at cobalt and lithium extraction, because many of the policy challenges I think we're talking about are raised also and discussed in that report. But perhaps then to move on directly to the second report, which is focused not so much on mitigation, but on climate change adaptation. And I should note that this was a particularly interesting report, I thought, to have put together, because IISD houses a team of experts in climate change, resilience and adaptation who support countries precisely in putting together national adaptation plans. And this team has done a lot of work in the Pacific Islands. And so this report, in fact, focuses on adaptation priorities that are often found in the Pacific. So I'm delighted to introduce Anne Hamill and David Hoffman from the resilience team to present this report. So I will hand the floor first to you, Anne. Go ahead, please.
Great, thanks, Alice. And thanks for this opportunity to dive into this topic a bit more. I think we've been hearing a lot about climate change and trade for a number of years now, and I think everybody can probably agree that the adaptation part of the equation is not really sort of explored as in depth as the mitigation side of the trade climate nexus. And so this was an opportunity for us to sort of unpack the links a bit more between trade and climate change, and in particular, if you actually go to the next slide, David, you know, when we look at the intersection of trade and adaptation, there are obviously different ways of coming at this. And so maybe sort of from the top, I should just clarify what we're talking about when we're talking about climate change adaptation. So here we're talking about dealing with the consequences of climate change. And so really preparing and protecting against the negative impacts of climate change, but also recognizing that there could be some opportunities associated with the impacts of climate change. And so adaptation is also about taking advantage of these new opportunities. But, you know, adaptation in sort of sum is really adjustments to the processes that we have, specific practices and structures. And we're talking about also fundamental shifts in how we make decisions. And so that's what we mean when we talk about adaptation. And when we talk about how adaptation intersects with trade, you know, there are sort of two directions that are largely highlighted. And so one, and I think the more sort of common way of understanding the links between adaptation and trade is, you know, trade itself is going to be affected by the impacts of climate change. And so what kind of measures can be put in place to adapt the international trading system, countries' sort of ability to participate in trade, what kind of measures can be put in place to deal with the consequences of climate change? And so that's sort of the adapting trade link. And then, but perhaps more, and the focus of this paper is actually the second one, and that's really about actually how can you leverage trade to advance the adaptation priorities of different countries and regions. And so really looking at how trade can help countries prepare for and adjust to these different impacts of climate change. And that's really the focus of this paper. Next slide, please. But you know, before we jump into how trade can be leveraged for climate change adaptation, we have to obviously, you know, acknowledge that this other sort of directional relationship exists. And so, you know, we spend a little bit at the beginning of the paper talking about how changing climate conditions will affect the movement, volume, and value of goods and services that are traded. And we call out in particular these 6 areas. Climate change is going to obviously affect trade infrastructure. We know that 80% of global trade passes through seaports, for example, and there's an estimate that over 50% of this infrastructure is exposed to the impacts of climate change. So there's going to be massive implications here. Agri-food commodities, you know, so here we're talking about trade in grains and food and fiber, livestock, and meat. And again, this is sort of one of the areas that's most commonly covered in adaptation research and policy. We know that climate change is going to affect global productivity of agricultural goods and services. And so, you know, we've got here an estimate that, you know, climate change can reduce global yields, agricultural yields, by up to 30% by 2050. So massive implications for economies and societies. And changing yields is going to affect prices, and then we've got competitiveness issues. So we know that there are some measures that are going to be needed and are already being put in place to help adapt that sector. Of course, there's going to be climate change impacts on non-agricultural commodities, whether we're talking here about forestry or mining, what have you, and the production facilities associated with those. And so, you know, again, we acknowledge those in the paper as well, and even sort of shine a light on some of the adaptation measures that are implemented here. And, you know, tourism is a really big one, particularly, I'd say, for a lot of coastal countries, small island developing states. Tourism is the 3rd biggest sector. in trade. And so we've got things like ocean acidification that's going to affect coral reefs, that's going to affect the sort of tourism draw of a lot of economies. And so what kinds of measures are being put in place to protect those economies and that sector in these countries? And then quickly, we also talk about climate change impacts on financial services and human mobility, which are also important to trade. And so talking about different adaptation measures that countries have already identified to adapt those areas. So that was sort of one sort of introductory area that we talked about, you know, the impacts of climate change on trade and adaptation measures that have already been identified by a number of countries to deal with these impacts. But like I said, the lion's share, the majority of this paper really looked at the other relationship. And so next slide, please. And that's really about, you know, how you leverage trade for adaptation. And we identified 3 pathways for using trade to help protect people, economies, and ecosystems from the impacts of climate change more broadly. The first pathway was really looking at domestic trade policy measures to facilitate access to and the diffusion of goods and services for adaptation. The second pathway is access to trade-related financing mechanisms to advance adaptation priorities. And then the third one was looking at international frameworks on trade or trade agreements and their role in helping countries and regions adapt to the impacts of climate change. And so I'm going to hand it over to David, who's going to talk a little bit more about these 3 pathways.
Thank you, Anne. Yes, I will quickly walk you through the different elements that we identified within these 3 pathways. There's quite a few of them, and we go into quite a bit of detail in the paper. So I'll provide a quick overview, really. So on the first pathway, we focused on domestic trade policy measures because, as you know, these can be designed and basically they can be designed in specific ways and molded to fit our purpose of supporting adaptation. And so more specifically, what we need is to facilitate access and also diffusion of specific goods and services, as Anne mentioned, and also the associated technologies that are required to adapt to climate change. And so within these, as part of these measures, I've listed here 6 main measures. So tariffs, a key measure. Of course, if one chooses to lower tariffs for the import and export of adaptation goods and services, then you're supporting adaptation. With subsidies, if you're allocating subsidies for specific adaptation goods and services, then, for example, if you're subsidizing the adoption of climate resilient crops, then you're also supporting adaptation. Government procurement rules are an important one. It's actually 12% of global GDP is spent according to government procurement rules. And so if you're able to shape those in a way that it sets specific conditions for adaptation goods and services, then the impact could be quite significant. On intellectual property rights, we identified that these can help to basically fast track some technology transfers. So it would enable governments to access and also use more quickly specific technologies as they emerge and that support adaptation. There are also private voluntary sustainability standards and labels. All these measures really help create more clarity and transparency as of what constitutes an adaptation good or service. And so it would benefit, for example, to be able to define specific tariffs or subsidies. Having standards of what defines an adaptation good and service would be really beneficial. And finally, also trade facilitation or trade and investment facilitation This is something that can essentially also fast track and speed up how fast goods and services can be traded, and especially in emergency situations. If you have a disaster that occurs, being able to trade quickly these adaptation goods and services would be beneficial. The second pathway focuses on trade-related financing mechanisms, and so how having access to those can actually be, or how these can be used also to support adaptation, right? And so within international trade, we found that the Aid for Trade initiative and also the enhanced integrated framework were quite promising, as they can be used to leverage finance. So in particular, Aid for Trade, and given the amount of investment needed in adaptation, there are obviously already adaptation finance mechanisms available, but if you can draw from other pots, so to speak, it would really be beneficial. So we found that the Aid for Trade could be leveraged as a co-financing pot to help access climate finance from the Green Climate Fund, for example, or the LDC fund or the Adaptation Fund, and also for the Aid for Trade mechanism. So if you're able to integrate adaptation considerations into this type of trade-related ODA, it will also contribute to ensuring that adaptation is a focus, or at least adaptation is not being undermined by ODA. So it's quite an important tool here. And for the EIF, as you may know, so the EIF uses specific what they call trade integration studies, and also action matrices, which help identify trade and development priorities. And so that they can be quite, well, they reveal current constraints to trade integration, and also they advise on key actions. And so if you're able to integrate climate adaptation concerns in the design of these studies, then it could also it would be helpful to help mobilize specific support or finance for adaptation. Third, we looked at international frameworks of trade, and in particular, we focused on trade agreements here for this paper. And we found that they really offer quite a few useful entry points for governments to identify and also advance mutual areas of interest through targeted cooperation. So they really are we see them we see a huge potential in trade agreements to support cooperation. And as of now, it's not really being utilized much. But so trade agreements can actually be used to support broader policy cooperation on adaptation at a broad level. For example, by including the intention of this type of support in the preamble of the trade agreement. It is also something that can be used to foster information sharing and dialogue, and enhance also cooperative capacity building. If you look at specific goods or services that are specifically identified in trade agreements, liberalizing the trade of these, these climate adaptation goods and services would also be a useful entry point for governments. Working toward harmonizing or mutual recognition of environmental standards and regulations is also another pathway or another entry point, as well as fostering climate resilient foreign direct investment and incentivizing climate adaptation through subsidies. as I said, it's elaborated in quite more detail in the report, but it's really just to provide an overview here of what we identified.
Super, David, thank you.
And I still have 2 slides or 3, 2 slides. Is that okay?
You're going to have to be really quick,
yes,
otherwise we're not going to have time.
I'll be extremely quick here. So it's important, I think, that we quickly just talk about the adaptation policy instruments, because we focus on what's there on the trade side, and on the adaptation side, one key instrument is the National Adaptation Plan process, so the NAP process, which was established in 2010. We know that we show in the paper how the NAP process can also be used or leveraged, or how we think that these different pathways can be used to support adaptation. So as a quick example, the NAP process actually helps governments identify priority adaptation measures following the identification of vulnerabilities. So you have specific adaptation measures that are being prioritized, and then what you could ask yourself, okay, for this measure, when it comes to the implementation of the measure, what goods and services are required to implement it? What trade policy instruments can be used to implement this measure? How can trade finance be used for this, well, to help finance this adaptation priority? And also trade agreements. How do trade agreements support the implementation of this measure? And in the report, we provide a few examples of specific adaptation measures that are prioritized in the Pacific. So here I refer to an example from Fiji. And finally, in building on these relationships and also these pathways, there are a few practical next steps and recommendations that we propose here towards the end of the paper, for basically strategically leveraging trade for advancing climate change adaptation. And I will just quickly read out, I think that the 5 key next steps are to establish contact between trade and adaptation policy actors, because we feel that contact hasn't been really made yet. We also think that you could support more the targeted engagement between trade and adaptation actors. There's also a recommendation to conduct in-country assessments of trade policy instruments, and the extent to which they support or constrain adaptation. Also trying to see how one could integrate adaptation in aid for trade specifically, and use existing tools that are out there to help identify entry points for integrating adaptation considerations in trade agreements. And I will leave it at that. Thank you.
Super, thank you. Thank you very much, David, and thank you very much, Anne. And again, apologies for rushing you. I hate it when people do it to me, but thank you very much for giving us a very succinct summary at the very end. I might next invite Ambassador Falemaker to provide some of your views, I mean, more generally on adaptation, its importance in the Pacific, and perhaps also the links to trade policy questions, to the extent that's become already a question in the PIF's context. So with that, Ambassador Falemaker, if you're still with us, the floor is yours. Please go ahead.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Alice, and thank you for convening this really interesting discussion and the presentation of IISD's analysis. Can you hear me? Sorry,
yes, we can. Go ahead. Okay. We can go ahead. Yeah.
Okay. Thank you. And let me also thank IISD for choosing the Pacific as case studies for this analysis, which has just been presented by Anne and also by David. So thanks to all of you. As you know, the issue of climate change has long been recognized by the forum, the Pacific Island Forum leaders, as the single most existential threat for Pacific countries. Threatens their survival, their livelihoods, and their economies. The the Forum Leaders Kainaki 2 Declaration of 2019 remains the most recent and the strongest statement by Pacific Island Forum leaders on climate change. They, of course, support the implementation of commitment of 1.5 degrees centigrade emissions. At the same time, that statement also focuses more on the adaptation. As you know, the Pacific countries are some of the most vulnerable. We are on the front line of climate change, and we're experiencing a lot more frequent and more intensive natural disasters as each year goes by. And any one of these disasters can wipe out a significant proportion of our GDP, as we've seen in Vanuatu in 2015, Cyclone Pam, over 60% of its GDP was wiped off, and more recently in Fiji and Tonga in 2016 and 2018, over 30% of their GDP were wiped off. So it was interesting to look at your analysis and basically to try and shift this focus to try and find solutions in how we adapt to these climatic conditions, because they exacerbate the vulnerability that we already face as small island economies. We are remote, we are fragmented, we have high trade costs, dependent on a handful of exports. But how do we configure ourselves in the face of climate change in order to sustain our economies? So I'd like to thank you really, IISD, for the very interesting and important analysis that you have done to bring together trade and sustainability issues. But I just wanted to make a few comments, given that we have very little time, and to respond to the three main pathways that you have identified clearly in your report. And we, at least from our side, support those three pathways as important steps that can be taken to assist in the adaptation of our economies to climate change. But just a few comments on all of these, on these three areas. First, on the domestic trade policy measures. This is really critical and should be the basis on which we can establish this shift towards ensuring adaptation to climate change. And I think what we've seen in the Pacific, and I thank you for the analysis that you've taken from the case studies, Kiribati, Tonga, and Fiji, that you have done in various sectors, infrastructure, agriculture, tourism, and so forth. And they basically bring out a significant point in my mind, and that is that we often are operating in silos. The environment ministries are working on these adaptation measures outside of what the trade ministries are doing, and there is no interface between that work, no coordination at that work at the national level. So this is why I see the value of this analysis that you have done, Alice, in bringing together and enforcing the point that we need to have mutually supportive coordinated policies between the trade policies and strategies and environmental policies and strategies. We need to infuse these into these two sets of policies. So that's the first thing on the trade, on the policies. The trade-related financing mechanism, I think this is also very important in order for countries like us to shift, or for any country to shift to adaptation measures. Funding, resourcing is always the most important factor, because you'll need new technologies, and you can use all of those trade instruments that David mentioned. You can use subsidies to influence investment, trade, and so forth. But you also need funding mechanism to support that transition. And I think what we found in the Pacific, we have a Pacific regional resilience strategy for the region that is helping all of our member countries to adapt our communities to climate change. And it is underpinned by a Pacific Resilience Facility, which is a funding mechanism And that funding mechanism has been agreed by leaders, and it's being established now. We are looking at the capitalization of that funding. But what we found is the imbalance in global funding facility towards mitigation against adaptation. That when we look at the allocation of global climate funding, 80% of funding goes to mitigation, while only 20% go to adaptation. So if we really have to make this shift for adaptation, we really need to be looking at further funding at the Green Climate Fund level. But it also, in my mind, provides another window of opportunity, which you presented today. How can we mobilize the trade finance, to complement the climate financing in order to shift our private sector, to shift our businesses to these adaptation policies? So that's my point on the funding, that we need to work on the two mechanisms, the climate financing mechanism and the trade financing. How can we make them mutually supportive to enable the shift? And the third pathway that you've eloquently provided, Alice, and I think it's really very timely, your analysis, because there are conversations here in Geneva, as you would note, on trade and environment initiatives in the WTO, in outcomes for UNCTAD, and there are these international events that we need to use to mobilize, to bring to the fore the importance of ministers mandating the work needed to ensure this shift or this adaptation. And so conversations in Geneva, in the WTO, in UNCTAD, well, in ITC, for instance, there are work going on there that we need also to influence, as well as COP26. These are the international events that are happening this year: MC12, COP26, UNCTAD 15, that need to be mobilized to make to bring to the fore the importance of trade and sustainability, to direct further work, to mandate further work, so that we can start to help assist developing countries, particularly countries like us that need technical assistance to develop our own strategies, and also funding and the how we can frame international treaties to be supportive of this shift towards sustainability. So that's probably what I just wanted to contribute, Alice. I don't know whether you expected more, but given the time, I think this is where I thought this analysis is really timely, because we really need information like this in order to engage in the conversations that are taking place in Geneva, to shape the conversations to MC12, to COP26, to UNCTAD 15, in order to secure the work that we need to assist us in future, going ahead in future. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you very much indeed to you, Ambassador. Thank you, Mere. I mean, very insightful and in fact extremely useful domestic reflections from the Pacific and the perspective of real sort of Pacific policymakers about how relevant the report is. So I'm delighted to hear it is relevant and helpful. And I have to underline, of course, none of these good ideas are mine. It is all very much my colleagues, Anne and David and my colleague Christoph Bellman, and the input of the reviewers. So full credit to them. But I'm really delighted the report is useful and speaks to the priorities of many developing countries, particularly the Pacific and particularly in Geneva. We are at time. We're in fact 1 minute over time, so conscious that people will all have other meetings to log into. I regret I won't be opening the floor for questions and answers this time, but what we will do is that, as ever, we will send around an email after this meeting with links to the reports that are available and the recording of the webinar once it's available as well. And in that email, you'll also have a link to a feedback form. where you can tell us if there were particular questions you had for the speakers, if there are particular topics that you think deserve more development, either in another webinar or in future research. And I think we've already seen in both the net zero and circular economy impacts on developing country exports and on the adaptation side, that these are relevant topical questions and ones in which trade policy, we think, can play an important role, and one that hasn't been properly explored and properly brought to the policy community yet. So we hope these reports start to generate that conversation, and this is of course work we look forward to building on in the months and years ahead. So thank you very much again to all of the presenters who we've had. Thank you to the researchers who put in the time to produce these, and of course to the UK government for their financial support. So with that, we'll be following this up with the email as I discussed, and please let us know in the feedback form or separately by email if there are other questions or comments or topics that you'd like to bring to our attention so that we can weave them into our own work plans. So with that, thank you very much for your patience. Thank you for sitting with us for this quick run through of the two reports. We hope they're useful to you, and we'll be sending you in the email links to them so you can read them in more detail. So with that,